The early morning sun bathed the streets of Denver, Colorado, in a golden glow, but inside the small suburban home of Emily and Jacob Harper, there was only silence. Their house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood where laughter of children often echoed. But for them, that joy had always been just out of reach. It was 2020, a year of trials for many, but for Emily and Jacob, the trials began long before. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, though she barely sipped it. Her once bright hazel eyes now carried a persistent weight, the shadows of sleepless nights etched beneath them. She absently traced the edge of the ceramic mug with her thumb, her gaze fixed on the wooden tabletop. Jacob entered the room, still wearing the gray hoodie he'd slept in. His dark hair was tousled, and a faint stubble lined his jaw. "Morning," he said softly, walking over to the coffee pot. His voice, like the air between them, was thick with unspoken sorrow. Emily glanced up, forcing a small smile. "Morning." Her voice was hoarse, as if it carried the weight of too many tears shed in solitude. Jacob poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter. He watched her, his heart aching for the woman he loved. She had once been so full of life, her laughter infectious, her dreams boundless. Now, it was as if the light within her had dimmed. He knew the feeling all too well. "You should eat something," he said gently. "I'm not hungry," she replied, her gaze dropping back to her cup. Jacob sighed, setting his coffee down. He walked over and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Em," he said, his blue eyes searching hers, "we can't keep doing this. We have to try to move forward." Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. "How? How do we move forward from losing her, Jake? She was our dream." Her voice cracked, and the tears spilled over, running down her cheeks. Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his shoulder. He stroked her hair, his own tears threatening to fall. "I don't know," he whispered, "but we'll figure it out together. We always do." The Harpers' journey to parenthood had been anything but easy. They had met in college, two dreamers with big plans for the future. Emily wanted to be a teacher, and Jacob had aspirations of starting his own tech company. They married their love strong and full of promise. But as the years passed, their dream of starting a family remained unfulfilled. Doctor's appointments and fertility treatments became their new normal, each unsuccessful attempt chipping away at their hope. Then one day, the impossible happened. Emily's pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines. She had cried with joy, clutching Jacob's hand as they celebrated the miracle they had long prayed for. They painted a nursery in soft pastel colors, filled it with stuffed animals and a crib Jacob assembled himself. They even named her before she was born, Lily. The name was perfect, representing purity and renewal. It felt like a fresh start, a symbol of the life they had fought so hard to create. The labor had been long and grueling. Emily remembered the sterile hospital room, the beeping machines, and Jacob's voice, steady and reassuring despite the fear in his eyes. Then came the silence, a silence that was louder than any scream. The doctors' faces were grim, their words clinical and detached. "I'm sorry, she didn't make it." Emily's world shattered in that moment. She barely remembered the days that followed. The funeral for a child they never got to know, the condolences from friends and family that felt more like daggers to her heart. Even now, 10 years later, the pain lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Jacob stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-dusted streets. He could hear the faint sound of children playing in the distance, their laughter like a cruel reminder of what they had lost. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath his grief. He hated the universe for what it had taken from them, but more than anything, he hated that he couldn't take away Emily's pain. "Maybe we should think about it again," he said, breaking the silence. Emily looked up, confused. "Think about what?" "Adoption." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. We've talked about it before. Maybe it's time to give it serious thought. Not as a replacement, he added quickly, but as a chance to share our love with a child who needs it. Emily hesitated, her heart torn. The idea had crossed her mind more than once, but she had always dismissed it, afraid it would feel like betraying Lily's memory. Yet, looking into Jacob's eyes, she saw a glimmer of hope, a determination that had always drawn her to him. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. You don't have to be, Jacob said softly. We can take it one step at a time. Together. Emily nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the mug. She wasn't sure if she could open her heart again, but for Jacob, and for the dream they once shared, she was willing to try. Denver's children's home was a modest, brick-faced building nestled among snow-covered trees on the edge of the city. The air was crisp, and the faint smell of pine lingered as Emily and Jacob Harper parked their car and stepped onto the icy pavement. The December sky was overcast, and the first flakes of a predicted snowstorm began to fall, dusting their coats as they walked toward the entrance. Are you sure about this? Emily asked, her breath visible in the cold air. She tightened the scarf around her neck, her hazel eyes filled with apprehension. Her steps were hesitant, as if the ground beneath her were unstable. Jacob reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I'm sure about us, he said. His blue eyes met hers, steady and warm. That's all that matters right now. She nodded, drawing strength from his confidence, though the knot of anxiety in her stomach remained. They entered the building, the warmth inside a sharp contrast to the chill outside. A receptionist at the front desk greeted them with a kind smile. You must be the Harpers, she said, standing to shake their hands. I'm Martha. Thank you so much for coming in today. Emily managed a polite smile, her palms slightly clammy. Jacob handled the formalities, his voice steady as he spoke with Martha. Emily's mind, however, was a whirlwind. She scanned the hallway, noting the colorful drawings taped to the walls, each one signed with a child's name. Her heart ached at the thought of how many children had poured their hopes and dreams into those pictures, waiting for a family to call their own. If you're ready, I'll take you to meet the children, Martha said after explaining the process. Jacob glanced at Emily, silently asking if she was prepared. She took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do this. The playroom was alive with movement and sound, a stark contrast to the quiet Emily and Jacob had grown accustomed to in their home. Children of various ages laughed, shouted, and played with toys. The room was painted in bright yellows and blues, its shelves filled with books and games. Emily stayed close to Jacob as they stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the children. Some were engaged in an intense game of Jenga, while others built elaborate towers with blocks. A few glanced at them curiously, but quickly returned to their activities. Then Emily's eyes fell on a girl sitting alone by a window, her small frame bathed in the soft light filtering through the glass. She couldn't have been older than 10. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a simple braid, and she was focused intently on a sketch pad, her pencil moving with purpose. Something about her struck Emily, a familiarity she couldn't place. She's beautiful, Emily whispered, nudging Jacob. He followed her gaze and nodded. Do you want to meet her? Emily hesitated, then nodded. They approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. Hi there, Jacob said gently, crouching to her level. What are you drawing? The girl looked up, her eyes a deep brown that seemed to hold a world of stories. She studied them for a moment before answering. It's a bird, she said, her voice quiet but steady. She turned the sketchpad toward them, revealing a beautifully detailed drawing of a sparrow. Emily's breath caught. The drawing was remarkable for someone her age, the lines precise, the shading delicate. That's amazing, she said. You're very talented. The girl offered a shy smile. Thank you. What's your name? Jacob asked. Sophie, she replied, her gaze flickering between them. Emily felt her chest tighten. There was something in Sophie's demeanor, her quiet confidence, that tugged at her heart. And then she noticed it. A small, crescent-shaped birthmark on Sophie's left shoulder, just peeking out from the neckline of her sweater. Her breath hitched. "Jacob," she murmured, touching his arm. He followed her gaze and saw it too. His heart raced, a mix of shock and something he didn't dare name. "Sophie," he said after a pause, his voice soft, "how would you feel about spending some time with us?" The girl's eyes widened slightly, her pencil still in her hand. "Like, as a family?" Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "Only if you want to. We think you're very special." Sophie hesitated, her gaze searching theirs. Slowly, she nodded. "I think I'd like that." That night, as they lay in bed, Emily couldn't stop replaying the day in her mind. "Jacob," she said in the darkness, "do you think it's possible that she could be—" He didn't let her finish. "We'll do a test," he said firmly. "But no matter what it says, Emily, that little girl needs us. And maybe we need her too." Emily turned toward him, tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Maybe this is our second chance," she whispered. Jacob pulled her close, his arms around her as the snow fell softly outside. For the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to dream. The first weeks with Sophia in their home were filled with a strange mixture of joy and unease. For Emily and Jacob Harper, the decision to adopt had been a leap of faith, a fragile hope for a future no longer defined by loss. But now, with Sophia's laughter echoing through their house, the walls that had once felt like a tomb seemed to breathe again. Yet, there were moments, small, fleeting, that left both Emily and Jacob questioning whether their connection to the girl was more than coincidence. It was a crisp autumn morning in Denver, the kind where the air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and fireplaces. Sophia sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, as she worked on a puzzle Emily had bought her from a local toy shop. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated her delicate features, the curve of her nose, the slight dimple in her left cheek when she concentrated. Emily watched her from the kitchen, a strange knot tightening in her chest. "She looks so much like you when you were a kid," Jacob remarked, his voice low as he stood beside Emily. He sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the little girl. Emily nodded but didn't speak. It was true. Sophia's resemblance to their own childhood photos was uncanny. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she tilted her head when she was curious, the soft hum she made when she was lost in thought. Emily felt an ache she couldn't quite name, a pull toward the girl that went beyond logic. Later that day, as Emily folded laundry in the bedroom, Sophia wandered in. She held up a drawing she had been working on, a crayon sketch of a house with a large tree in the yard. "This is us," Sophia said proudly, pointing to the stick figures beneath the tree. "That's you, and that's Daddy, and that's me." Emily smiled, her heart warming. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I love it." Sophia beamed and climbed onto the bed beside her. As she did, the neckline of her sweater slipped slightly, revealing a small, faint birthmark on her shoulder. Emily's breath caught. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the mark. "What's that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sophia looked down at her shoulder. "Oh, that? It's just my spot. I've had it forever. Do you have one too?" She remembered the birthmark Jacob had on his shoulder, almost identical in shape and placement. Her hand trembled as she smoothed Sophia's sweater back into place. "No, I don't," she said softly. "But Daddy does." Sophia's face lit up. "Really? That's so cool. Maybe that's why we're family now." Emily forced a smile, but her heart pounded. As Sophia bounded out of the room, chattering about her drawing, Emily sat frozen, her mind replaying the moment. That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Emily found Jacob in the den, going over some documents for work. She leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. Jacob looked up, concern flashing in his blue eyes. "What is it?" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "It's Sophia. There's something about her I can't ignore anymore." Jacob set his papers aside and leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated, struggling to find the words. "She has a birthmark on her shoulder. It's just like yours, Jake. Same shape, same spot." Jacob frowned, his brows knitting together. "That's strange, but it could just be a coincidence, right?" "Maybe," Emily admitted. "But it's not just that. The way she moves, the things she says. She reminds me so much of you, of us." Jacob sat back, his mind working through her words. "Are you saying you think she's—" Emily nodded, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm saying, but we need to find out. We need to know." The next day, Emily made the call to a local DNA testing lab. The process was straightforward, a simple cheek swab for both of them and Sophia. She told Sophia it was a fun science project, and the little girl giggled as Jacob explained how DNA worked. But beneath their smiles, both Emily and Jacob felt the weight of what they were doing. As they sealed the samples and prepared to mail them, Emily felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. If Sophia was their daughter, it would mean everything they had lost wasn't truly gone. But it would also raise questions they weren't sure they were ready to face. "Whatever happens," Jacob said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, "we'll handle it together, just like always." Emily nodded, leaning into him. Together, they dropped the envelope into the mailbox, their hearts pounding in unison. The truth was out there now, waiting to be uncovered. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of the Harper household, casting warm, golden rays across the kitchen. Emily sat at the dining table, her fingers lightly drumming on the surface as she waited for Jacob to return with the mail. The air was tense with anticipation. The results of the DNA test would arrive today. "Mom?" Sophia's voice broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, her dark curls slightly tousled from sleep, holding the stuffed bear Emily had given her the week before. Emily's heart clenched at the sight of her. Sophia had already begun calling them Mom and Dad, a habit that filled Emily with both joy and trepidation. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Sophia nodded and padded over to sit beside her, placing the bear on the table. "Do you think we can go to the park later?" Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Sophia's face. "Of course. After breakfast, we'll see if Dad wants to join us." As if summoned, Jacob walked in, a stack of envelopes in his hand. His face was unreadable, but Emily knew him well enough to sense the undercurrent of tension. He met her eyes and gave a slight nod, indicating the envelope they'd been waiting for was among the pile. "Sophia, why don't you go get ready for the park?" Emily said gently. "We'll be out in a little while." Sophia looked between them, her sharp intuition catching the subtle shift in their mood, but she didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, grabbing her bear and heading upstairs. Jacob set the mail down on the table and pulled out the white envelope. The bold logo of the DNA testing center was printed in the corner, making Emily's stomach churn. "This is it," Jacob said, his voice low. Emily reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "Open it," she whispered. Jacob slid a finger under the seal, carefully pulling out the folded papers inside. The room felt impossibly still as he scanned the document, his eyes darting over the lines of text. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of shock and overwhelming emotion. "It's her," he said, his voice trembling. "Emily, she's our daughter." The words hit her like a tidal wave. Tears sprang to her eyes as she covered her mouth with her hand. "Are you sure?" she managed to ask, though she already knew the answer. Jacob nodded, his own eyes glistening. A 99.9% match. She's ours, Emily. Emily let out a shaky breath, her mind racing. All the moments they'd shared with Sophia over the past few weeks suddenly took on new meaning. The way she laughed, the way her eyes lit up when she was excited, even her quiet moments of reflection. It was all so familiar now. But beneath the joy of discovery was a dark undercurrent of anger and confusion. "How?" she asked, her voice firmer. "How is this possible? They told us she died, Jacob. How could this happen?" Jacob set the paper down and placed his hands on her shoulders. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're going to find out. Someone lied to us, and we're not going to let them get away with it." Emily nodded, her determination hardening. "We need to protect her. Whoever did this needs to be held accountable. They stole 10 years from us, Jacob. 10 years. "I know," he said, his jaw tightening. "But we have her now, and we're not going to lose her again." Later that day, while Sophia played in the park with other children, Jacob and Emily sat on a bench, their voices low as they discussed their next steps. "The hospital," Emily said. "We start there. We need to get the records from the day she was born." Jacob nodded. "I'll call tomorrow. We'll request everything, medical files, birth records, anything they have." Emily hesitated. What if they try to cover it up? If someone was involved in trafficking or something else, they'll do everything they can to hide it. Jacob's expression darkened. "Then we'll go to the police. If there's a paper trail, we'll find it. And if there isn't, we'll make sure someone answers for this." Emily glanced over at Sophia, who was laughing as she climbed the jungle gym. The sight filled her with a fierce protectiveness. "She deserves to know the truth," she said softly, "and so do we." Jacob reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll get it, Em. Whatever it takes." As they sat there, watching their daughter play, a sense of resolve settled over them. The Harpers had endured a decade of pain and loss, but now they had something precious to fight for. And they wouldn't stop until they uncovered the truth. The following morning, Jacob and Emily Harper stood before the imposing glass facade of St. Mary's Medical Center. The hospital, sprawling and modern, had been a place of heartbreak for them a decade ago. Now, it loomed as a silent keeper of the secrets that had stolen 10 years of their lives. "You ready?" Jacob asked, his voice steady but low. He placed a comforting hand on Emily's back. She nodded, clutching a folder that contained all the paperwork they had gathered over the years. Birth records, death certificates, and now, the DNA test results. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, though her heart pounded in her chest. Together, they pushed through the revolving doors and entered the brightly lit lobby. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit Emily immediately, triggering a flood of memories. She squeezed Jacob's hand for grounding. "Let's find the records office," Jacob said, scanning the directory. They navigated the hallways until they reached a small, unassuming door labeled Patient Records. Inside, a receptionist sat behind a thick glass partition, typing on a keyboard. Jacob stepped forward. "Good morning. We're here to request some records related to a birth and death from 2010. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Emily recognized, a barely restrained anger. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up. "Of course. Do you have authorization?" Emily slid the folder across the counter. "We have all the necessary documents, including proof of parentage." The woman's expression softened as she reviewed the papers. "This may take some time. Please have a seat." They waited in tense silence, the seconds stretching into minutes. Emily's foot tapped nervously against the tiled floor. Finally, the receptionist returned, her face unreadable. "I've located the files. However, you'll need to speak with Dr. Wilson. He was the attending physician during the case. I'll page him for you." Jacob exchanged a look with Emily. "Doctor?" Wilson? He's still here? Yes, the receptionist said. He's the head of pediatrics now. Emily's stomach churned. Dr. Wilson had been the one to deliver the devastating news that their daughter hadn't survived. She remembered his sympathetic tone, the way he had avoided meeting her eyes, and now he was the one they needed answers from. Dr. Wilson met them in a private conference room, his white coat pristine, his demeanor professional. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, but his sharp blue eyes hadn't dulled. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper," he began, his tone courteous but distant. "I understand you have questions about your daughter's case." Jacob didn't waste time. "We received a DNA test confirming that Sophia, a child we recently adopted, is biologically ours. How is that possible when we were told she died at birth?" Dr. Wilson's composure faltered for a split second before he leaned back in his chair. "That is a serious allegation. I'd like to review the records with you to better understand the situation." Emily's voice was sharp. "It's not an allegation. It's a fact. Our daughter was stolen from us." The doctor sighed, pulling up digital records on a tablet. "According to the file, your daughter was pronounced stillborn due to complications during delivery. However," he trailed off, his brows furrowing as he scrolled through the notes. "However what?" Jacob demanded. Dr. Wilson's face turned grim. "There's a discrepancy here. The attending nurse's signature is missing from the death certificate, and—" He hesitated, clearly unsettled. "And the body transfer log shows irregularities. It's as if the remains were never officially processed." Emily's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Wilson said carefully, "that something was mishandled, or worse, deliberately falsified." Jacob's fists clenched. "Who would do this, and why?" Dr. Wilson shook his head. "I'll need time to investigate, but if what you're suggesting is true, this could involve illegal activity, possibly even human trafficking." Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "Human trafficking?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's rare, but not unheard of," Dr. Wilson admitted. "Hospitals are supposed to have safeguards in place to prevent this kind of thing, but no system is perfect." Jacob stood abruptly. "We're not waiting for you to investigate. We're going to the police." "I understand, Doctor," Wilson said, "and I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. But please know that this will take time. Whoever was involved likely covered their tracks well." Emily and Jacob left the hospital feeling both vindicated and overwhelmed. The truth was closer now, but it was tangled in a web of deceit and corruption that would take more than determination to unravel. As they drove home, Emily stared out the window, her mind racing with possibilities. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" she asked softly. Jacob tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I don't know, but whether he is or not, we're going to find out everything, and we're going to make them pay for what they did." Emily glanced at the back seat, where Sophia sat humming to herself, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She looked so small, so innocent. Emily's resolve hardened. She would protect her daughter at all costs, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. The courtroom was filled with an electric tension that crackled in the air. Rows of people sat quietly, their eyes fixed on the judge's bench as the clerk called the session to order. Emily and Jacob Harper sat in the front row, their hands clasped together tightly, a silent show of unity as they prepared to face the people who had shattered their lives. Sophia wasn't with them. She was home with a trusted family friend, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the day. Emily had insisted on shielding her daughter from the darker truths until she was old enough to understand. The defendants were seated at the table opposite the Harpers. Among them was Nurse Patricia Monroe, whose name had surfaced in the investigation, and Dr. Anthony Graves, a now-retired administrator who had overseen operations at St. Mary's Medical Center in 2010. Both looked stoic, but the occasional flicker of unease betrayed their nerves. The weeks leading up to the trial had been grueling. After uncovering the discrepancies in Sophia's medical records, the Harpers had worked closely with Detective Laura Mason, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for cracking complex cases. Detective Mason had unraveled a sinister scheme within the hospital. Dr. Graves and Nurse Monroe were part of a covert network that exploited vulnerable families. Babies pronounced stillborn were quietly sold to private brokers, their paperwork falsified to erase any trace of their true origins. It was a chilling revelation that had shaken the community and sparked outrage. The Harpers had been key witnesses, their testimony bolstered by DNA evidence, hospital logs, and recorded confessions from lower-level staff who had turned against Graves and Monroe in exchange for leniency. As the prosecution presented its case, Emily found herself reliving the pain of that fateful day in 2010. The birth, the crushing announcement of her daughter's death, the numbing grief that had followed. It all came rushing back as the prosecutor displayed forged documents and cited testimonies from former employees. Nurse Patricia Monroe knowingly falsified death certificates, the prosecutor declared, his voice ringing through the courtroom. And Dr. Anthony Graves orchestrated the illegal sale of newborns, exploiting the trust of grieving parents for personal gain. Their actions are unconscionable. Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to cry out, to demand answers, but she stayed silent, her focus on the judge and jury. When it was the defense's turn, they tried to paint Monroe and Graves as scapegoats, claiming they had been coerced by more powerful figures who remained at large. But their arguments faltered in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The prosecutor called Emily to the stand. She took a deep breath as she walked to the witness box, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Jacob gave her an encouraging nod as she passed. "Mrs. Harper," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the impact this ordeal has had on your family?" Emily's voice trembled at first, but she found her strength as she spoke. "When they told us our daughter was dead, it broke us. We spent years grieving her, blaming ourselves, wondering what went wrong. And then, 10 years later, to discover that she was alive, that she had been taken from us. It was devastating in a completely different way. But it was also a gift. We found her. And now we're here because no family should ever have to endure what we did." Her words hung in the air, raw and powerful. The jury watched her intently, their expressions reflecting sympathy and anger. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The judge's gavel struck sharply as the courtroom fell silent. "Dr. Anthony Graves and Nurse Patricia Monroe," the judge intoned, "you have been found guilty of conspiracy, human trafficking, forgery, and numerous violations of medical ethics. Your actions have caused irreparable harm, and this court will ensure you are held accountable." The sentences were harsh. Life in prison for Graves, who had masterminded the operation, and 25 years for Monroe, who had played an instrumental role. As the verdict was read, Emily felt a weight lift from her chest. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as the Harpers emerged hand in hand. Jacob held up a hand to shield Emily from the onslaught, guiding her through the crowd as Detective Mason escorted them to safety. Once they reached their car, Emily collapsed into the passenger seat, her body trembling from the release of tension. Jacob leaned over, kissing her forehead gently. "It's over," he said softly. "We did it." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "For Sophia," she whispered. As they drove home, the city lights of Denver sparkled in the distance. For the first time in a decade, the future felt bright. They had their daughter, their family, and the promise of a life free from the shadows of the past. And that was enough. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine as the Harpers walked through the sprawling park in downtown Denver. The late autumn sun filtered through the golden leaves, casting warm patterns of light on the path. It had been 3 months since the trial, and life was finally beginning to feel normal again. Or at least, their new version of normal. Emily watched Sophia skip ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased a butterfly fluttering just out of reach. The sight filled Emily with a joy she hadn't felt in years. For so long, the idea of seeing her daughter happy had been nothing more than a distant, impossible dream. Now it was her reality. "She's thriving," Jacob said, stepping beside Emily and slipping his hand into hers. "You're doing an amazing job with her." Emily smiled, leaning into him. "We're doing an amazing job. I couldn't do this without you." They paused by a bench, watching Sophia dart between the trees. The little girl had adjusted to her new life with remarkable resilience, though she still asked questions about her years in the orphanage and the sad days before she was adopted. She seemed to find comfort in Emily and Jacob's unwavering love. "Do you think she remembers anything about before?" Emily asked softly. Jacob hesitated, his gaze fixed on their daughter. "I think she'll carry some of it with her, but she's strong, and we're giving her a future where she doesn't have to carry it alone." That evening, the Harpers sat around the dining table, the smell of Emily's homemade lasagna wafting through the house. The warm, inviting home was a stark contrast to the sterile, impersonal environment of Sophia's orphanage. It had taken time, but their house now felt like a true sanctuary. "Can I help with anything, Mom?" Sophia asked, standing on her tiptoes to peek at the casserole dish. Emily's heart swelled at the word Mom. It still felt new, even though Sophia had started using it weeks ago. "You can set the table," she said, handing Sophia the silverware. Sophia carried the utensils to the table with the careful precision of someone performing an important task. As she placed each fork and knife in its proper spot, she hummed a tune Emily didn't recognize. It was a small moment, but it was these little acts of normalcy that meant everything. During dinner, Sophia's curiosity bubbled to the surface. "When I grow up, can I be a doctor?" she asked, her wide eyes fixed on Jacob. Jacob grinned. "Of course you can. You can be anything you want." Sophia tilted her head thoughtfully. "Even an astronaut?" "Even an astronaut," Jacob affirmed. "But first, you have to eat your vegetables." Sophia groaned dramatically, but the playful glint in her eyes betrayed her amusement. One weekend, the Harpers drove to a nearby lake, a place Emily had visited often during the years of her grief. It had been her sanctuary, a place where she could cry, reflect, and hold on to the hope that someday life might surprise her. They brought a small wooden box filled with mementos, the tiny blanket Sophia had been wrapped in at birth, a hospital bracelet, and the photo of her ultrasound that had once been the only tangible proof of her existence. Emily had held on to these items through the darkest days, but now they felt like relics of a life they had finally reclaimed. Standing by the water, they opened the box together. Sophia looked at the items with wide eyes. "This was mine?" she asked, holding up the bracelet. Emily knelt beside her. "Yes, sweetheart. These things were all we had of you for a very long time, but now we have you. We don't need these anymore." Sophia nodded solemnly, understanding the significance even if she couldn't fully grasp the emotions behind it. "Would you like to help us let them go?" Jacob asked gently. Sophia smiled and placed the bracelet back in the box. Together they set it adrift on the water. The box floated for a moment before sinking, disappearing beneath the surface. It was a symbolic act, a way of letting go of the pain and making space for the life they were building together. That night, as Emily tucked Sophia into bed, the little girl reached out and held her hand. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "I'm glad I found you," Sophia said, her voice soft and sincere. Tears pricked Emily's eyes, but she smiled through them. "We're the ones who found you, my love, and we're never letting go." As Sophia drifted off to sleep, Emily sat by her side for a while, listening to her even breathing. The house was quiet, filled with a peace she had never thought possible. In that moment, Emily knew they had been given a second chance, a second birth for their family. Downstairs, Jacob was waiting with 2 cups of tea. As Emily joined him on the couch, they sat together in silence, gazing out the window at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter than usual, as if the universe itself was celebrating their newfound happiness. "We did it," Jacob said softly, his voice filled with awe. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "We did." And as the warmth of their home wrapped around them, the Harpers knew they had truly begun a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities.